At 6:17 in the morning, I learned that silence can cost more than money. I said it out loud without realizing, standing in the kitchen while the coffee machine clicked through its last drops, because something on my phone had already changed the temperature of the entire house. My name is Daniel Carter, and for most of my adult life, I believed financial stability was something you built slowly, carefully, like brick over brick, until one day it simply stood strong enough that nothing could shake it. That morning, though, I stared at a screen that told a different story. The joint account I shared with my wife, Rachel Carter, the account we used for everything from mortgage payments to grocery runs to utility bills, was empty. Not low, not strained, empty. I checked again because the mind always looks for permission to reject reality before it accepts it. Same number, same absence, same quiet certainty that something had already been taken. The kitchen light above me hummed softly, the kind of sound you never notice until everything else goes wrong. Rachel walked in a few minutes later, barefoot, holding her coffee like it was just another ordinary Tuesday morning. She kissed my cheek without looking at my phone. "You're up early," she said, voice calm, almost light, like nothing in the world had shifted. I didn't answer right away. I just watched her move around the kitchen, opening cabinets, the same rhythm she had every morning for years. There was a version of me, not so long ago, that would have taken comfort in that routine. But now every movement felt measured against the number I had just seen. I finally asked her, not loudly, not accusing, just steady enough to stay controlled. "Did you move money from the account?" She paused for half a second too long. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. Then she shrugged like I had asked about the weather. "I needed to secure some things," she said, taking a sip of coffee. Secure. That word didn't belong in a marriage between two people who were supposed to be building together. It belonged in transactions, in negotiations, in endings that had already been decided somewhere else. I set my phone face down on the counter because staring at it wasn't going to change what it showed me. Rachel sat across from me like this was still normal life, scrolling through her own phone now, occasionally smiling at something that wasn't me, wasn't us, wasn't anything I could recognize anymore. And then she said it, almost casually, like she was mentioning dinner plans. "The divorce papers are being filed today." There was no build-up, no argument, no emotional spillover, just a statement placed in the air like it had already been finalized somewhere I wasn't invited to. I remember nodding once, not because I agreed, but because my mind was trying to map reality against everything I thought I understood about the last 12 years of marriage. We had built a life together in suburban Illinois, a house just outside Naperville, 2 cars in the driveway, shared accounts, shared routines, shared language. At least I thought it was shared. Rachel stood up, placed her mug in the sink, and grabbed her keys. "I'll be back later," she said, like the conversation had already ended. The door closed behind her with a soft click that felt louder than anything else in the house. I stayed where I was, listening to the refrigerator hum, the clock tick, the faint sound of traffic outside beginning to build as the world kept moving without waiting for me to catch up. That was the moment I understood something simple and unsettling. This wasn't a breakdown happening in real time. This was something that had already been in motion long before I noticed it. And while she drove away with whatever certainty she had built for herself, I was still standing in a kitchen, realizing that the first real question I needed to answer wasn't what she had taken, but how long she had been planning to take it. The silence in the house did not feel empty. It felt structured, like someone had already rearranged it without asking me. I stood in the kitchen longer than I intended, watching the light shift across the counter as if time itself had become uncertain. After Rachel left, I expected noise in my head, anger, confusion, something sharp enough to match what had just happened. Instead, there was a strange clarity, like my thoughts had stepped back and started observing me instead of participating. I picked up my phone again, unlocked it, and checked the account for the 3rd time, even though I already knew what I would see. Nothing had changed. The balance still reflected a decision made without me. I opened the transaction history, scrolling slowly, noticing patterns instead of individual entries. Over the past 3 weeks, small withdrawals had been stacking together like pieces of a structure I had failed to notice being built. Transfers to an external account I did not recognize. Adjustments labeled in ways that felt intentionally vague. Every detail was clean enough to avoid attention. but together they told a story that no longer felt accidental. My phone vibrated in my hand, pulling me out of the pattern. A notification from a legal email account I had not used in years appeared on the screen. Subject line, Notice of Divorce Filing. I did not open it immediately. I just stared at it, letting the words sit there long enough to become real. When I finally opened it, the language was formal, detached, carefully constructed to sound neutral, even though it described the end of 12 years of shared life. There was a listed attorney, a scheduled filing date, and instructions regarding financial disclosures. It was all procedural, all clean, all completely detached from anything that felt human. I set the phone down on the counter again and leaned back slightly, exhaling through my nose, not because I was calm, but because my body was trying to regulate something my mind had not fully accepted yet. I thought about Rachel that morning, the way she moved through the kitchen like everything was ordinary. That was what unsettled me the most. There had been no visible rupture, no emotional warning, no moment where the life I knew visibly broke. Instead, it had been quietly rewritten in stages I had not been invited to see. I walked into the living room and sat down, not because I needed rest, but because standing felt unnecessary. The house outside was still the same suburban street in Naperville, Illinois, the same morning traffic passing by, the same routine. World continuing without interruption. From the outside, nothing had changed at all. That contrast made everything inside feel sharper. I started thinking back, not emotionally, but structurally, trying to locate the point where things had shifted. It was not one moment. It was several small adjustments that I had dismissed at the time. Rachel spending more time on her phone late at night, turning the screen away when I entered the room. Conversations that ended faster than they used to. Questions about financial accounts that felt more precise than casual curiosity. At the time, I had labeled all of it as stress, work pressure, normal marriage fluctuations. Now those memories reassembled themselves into something more deliberate. My phone rang again. This time I answered. It was a short conversation with my bank representative, confirming activity I had already seen but needed to hear from someone else to fully accept. There had been authorization changes, access updates, and account restructuring requests initiated from within our shared profile. All within policy, all technically valid, all initiated in a way that suggested preparation rather than impulse. When the call ended, I remained seated, holding the phone loosely in my hand. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt like it belonged to both of us. It felt like a space in transition, waiting for instructions that had already been given. I realized then that what I was dealing with was not just separation. It was sequencing. Every action had been staged in advance, every step positioned to lead to this exact moment where I would be the last one to understand what had already been completed. And as I sat there, I understood something else beneath the surface of that realization. Whoever had planned this had not been reacting to the end of a marriage. They had been executing a plan that assumed I would not see it coming until it was already finished. The moment I stayed seated in that living room, I realized the quiet was no longer passive. It was informative, like the house itself was waiting for me to catch up to something it already understood, and I started doing what I had always done when systems around me failed to make sense. I broke them down into steps, not emotions, not assumptions, just sequence and structure. I opened my laptop and logged into every financial platform we had ever shared, starting with the primary bank, then the savings account, then the credit union we had opened years ago when we first bought the house in Naperville, Illinois. And with each login, I felt less like a husband reacting to a crisis and more like someone reviewing documentation after the fact. Because everything I saw confirmed the same pattern, authorization changes made in increments, access permissions adjusted quietly, notifications redirected to an email address I rarely checked. And even though nothing about it violated any obvious warning system, the accumulation of it made one thing clear: this was not improvised. This was designed. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes move across the screen without rushing, because rushing would not change what was already done. And then I did something I had not expected to do that morning. I called the bank again, this time asking for full account audit history, not just transactions but access logs, device approvals, and administrative changes. The representative on the line was professional, almost detached, reading information back to me in a calm tone that made everything sound smaller than it felt. But the details were not small. There had been multiple login sessions from devices that were registered under Rachel's credentials, but initiated outside of our usual home network. There had been scheduled transfers set to trigger in stages rather than all at once. And there had even been changes to overdraft protections that suggested someone was preparing for instability rather than avoiding it. When I ended the call, I did not feel anger. I felt alignment. Like scattered pieces of a puzzle had finally clicked into a shape that could no longer be ignored. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street, the same street where neighbors walked dogs and children rode bicycles, where everything appeared stable by design, and I thought about how easy it was for entire systems to look untouched while being completely restructured beneath the surface. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Rachel, short, neutral, asking if I had seen the filing notice. There was no emotion in it, no hesitation, just confirmation that she was moving forward on schedule. I did not reply immediately. Instead, I opened a new folder on my laptop and began organizing everything I had just learned into a timeline, not because I wanted control over the situation, but because clarity was the only thing that kept me from reacting too early. As I built that timeline, I started to see the shape of it more clearly. The first financial inquiries she had made months ago disguised as curiosity, the gradual shift of small amounts that no one would question individually, the update of recovery email addresses that ensured she would always have priority access, and finally the legal preparation that had been waiting in parallel long before I ever saw the account empty. I closed the laptop for a moment and pressed my fingers against the edge of the table, not out of frustration but out of recognition, because what I was looking at was not betrayal in the emotional sense people usually talk about. It was infrastructure, carefully assembled and quietly executed. And in that realization, something in me settled instead of breaking, because now I understood the rules of what I was dealing with. I picked up my phone and called someone I had not spoken to in years, a financial attorney whose number I still had saved from when we first bought the house. And when he answered, I did not explain everything at once. I simply said I needed a full review of shared assets, liabilities, and access exposure. His response was immediate, professional, and direct, asking me to send everything I had. After the call ended, I began compiling documents, statements, screenshots, authorization logs, and every notification I had ignored over the past months, laying them out not as evidence of emotion, but as evidence of process. And as the afternoon light shifted across the room, I realized something else. Rachel had not just withdrawn money or filed papers. She had initiated a system that assumed I would respond emotionally and fall behind structurally. And the only way to survive a system like that was not to match emotion, but to move with precision she had already taught me to recognize, even if she never intended me to understand it this early. By the time the afternoon settled over the house, I had already stopped treating the situation as something that would resolve itself and started treating it as something that would require structure, because structure was the only thing that kept me from slipping into reaction, and reaction was exactly what the situation seemed designed to provoke. I sat at my desk with all the documents spread across two screens, one showing bank access logs and the other showing legal correspondence, and I noticed something subtle that changed the way I viewed everything. The timing of each action was not random. It followed a rhythm, almost like someone had planned pauses between each financial adjustment and each legal step to avoid triggering alerts too early. I leaned closer to the screen and cross-referenced timestamps with email metadata, and what I found was not dramatic in the way people expect betrayal to be. It was methodical, like watching a system update itself one line of code a day. Time. I noted every pattern carefully, because patterns mattered more than intent at this stage, and intent was no longer something I could afford to debate. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone lit up again, Rachel's name appearing on the screen. I answered without hesitation this time, keeping my voice steady. She did not sound emotional. There was no anger, no regret, only confirmation. She asked if I had received the filing notice and if I had any questions about next steps. The way she spoke made it clear she expected compliance, not resistance. I told her I had received it. And then there was a brief pause, the kind of pause that carries more weight than words. She then added that temporary financial arrangements would be enforced through legal channels and that I should expect restricted access to shared accounts within the week. Her tone was calm, almost administrative, like she was reading from a checklist rather than speaking to someone she had built a life with. When the call ended, I remained still, holding the phone in my hand, not because I was frozen, but because I was processing the final layer of the structure she had built. She was not improvising anymore. She was executing. I turned back to the screen and opened a secure folder where I had begun consolidating everything, and I added the call log to the timeline, marking it as a confirmation point rather than new information, because nothing she had just said changed the direction of what I had already started to understand. I stood up and walked through the house again, noticing details I had ignored for years, shared spaces that now felt like neutral zones rather than personal ones, photographs that suddenly looked like records instead of memories, and a kitchen that still smelled faintly like the coffee she had made that morning. I paused near the entryway and looked at the front door, realizing how many times I had walked through it, assuming stability was permanent rather than conditional. I returned to my desk and began drafting a formal response through my attorney, keeping every sentence factual, every reference precise, avoiding emotional language entirely, because emotional language belonged to a version of this situation that no longer existed. I attached financial documentation, account summaries, and access logs, and requested immediate review of asset protection options under Illinois law. As I worked through each step, I noticed something shifting internally, not anger, not sadness, but focus, a narrowing of attention that removed everything unnecessary. I began to understand that what Rachel had initiated was not simply the end of a marriage. It was a controlled transition of assets and access designed to create imbalance before negotiation even began. And the only way to respond without losing ground was to operate at the same level of precision she had already chosen. When the sun began to lower outside the window, I realized I had not once looked for emotional meaning in what had happened. I had only looked for structure, because structure was the only thing that could be measured, challenged, or rebuilt. And as I saved the final file and closed my laptop for the moment, I understood that whatever came next would not be about reaction anymore. It would be about control of sequence, timing, and information. And for the first time since that morning, I felt the situation shift from something happening to me into something I could finally begin to navigate on my own terms. By the time the evening settled into the neighborhood, I had already stopped measuring the situation in terms of surprise and started measuring it in terms of exposure. Because once you accept that something has been carefully structured against you, the only thing left to understand is how deep the structure goes. I sat in my home office with the lights dimmed and the glow of the monitors reflecting off the glass surface of the desk, and I reviewed everything again, not because I expected new information, but because repetition often reveals what urgency hides. The financial logs, the legal notices, the access changes, all of it formed a timeline that no longer looked like scattered actions, but like a coordinated sequence designed to converge at a specific point in time. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to remove distraction. Because distraction is where most people lose control of situations like this. When I opened my eyes again, I began shifting my focus away from what had already happened and toward what was still active. I made a list, not emotionally, but operationally: shared accounts, authorized cards, recurring payments, property links, digital access points, and each item on that list represented a potential lever that could still be adjusted by either side. Around 7 in the evening, my attorney called back, his tone steady and precise, confirming he had reviewed the initial documentation I sent earlier. He explained that what I was seeing was consistent with pre-filing financial positioning, meaning one party establishes access control adjustments in advance of formal legal separation to reduce exposure and stabilize their position before negotiation begins. He did not use emotional language, only procedural terms, and that clarity made everything feel even more concrete. I asked him what immediate actions were available within legal boundaries to prevent further unauthorized financial movement, and he responded with a list of options, including temporary account restrictions, notification locks, and expedited financial disclosure demands, each step requiring documentation, but each step also reinforcing structural balance. After the call ended, I sat for a long time without moving, not because I was uncertain, but because I was mapping consequences in sequence rather than reacting to them individually. Outside my office window, the streetlights had begun to turn on one by one, and the neighborhood looked unchanged: people walking dogs, cars pulling into driveways, ordinary routines continuing without interruption, and that contrast made it easier to think clearly. Because nothing in the external environment matched the internal shift that had already taken place, my phone lit up again with a message from Rachel asking if I had reviewed the proposed temporary arrangements regarding financial access and shared responsibilities. The wording was careful, controlled, and framed as coordination rather than conflict. I read it twice and did not respond immediately. Instead, I opened a new document and began outlining a counter-structure with my attorney's guidance, focusing on maintaining visibility over all shared financial channels while restricting unilateral adjustments. I realized as I worked that this was no longer about recovery or emotional resolution. It was about equilibrium, because whoever controlled timing controlled perception, and whoever controlled perception controlled leverage. I saved the document and closed my laptop for a moment, walking into the kitchen to get water, noticing again how normal everything looked. How easily a life could appear intact while its internal framework was being rewritten in parallel systems. I understood then that Rachel had not simply initiated separation, she had initiated repositioning, and the only viable response was not resistance in the emotional sense, but stabilization in the structural sense, ensuring that every remaining connection between us was accounted for, visible, and governed by process rather than assumption. When I returned to my desk, I no longer felt like I was catching up. I felt like I was finally operating within the same timeline she had started weeks earlier, and that realization changed the way I approached every next decision. Because from this point forward, nothing would be addressed in isolation. Everything would be treated as part of a connected system that could either be balanced or allowed to tip further out of control, depending entirely on the precision of the response. By the time the night settled fully over Naperville, I had already stopped dividing the situation into hours and started dividing it into decisions, because time was no longer something passive. It was something being used by both sides in different ways, and I needed to understand exactly how much of it had already been spent without me. I sat at my desk with the house dark behind me except for the faint glow spilling from my monitors, and I went through everything again with a level of attention that removed all assumption, every financial record, every access log, every legal document that had been forwarded to me or retrieved through my attorney, and slowly the structure became more visible, not in dramatic shifts, but in small, precise alignments that pointed in one direction, forward, away from shared control, and toward unilateral positioning. I paused at one specific detail in the timeline, a set of account adjustments made just before the formal filing date, and I realized those adjustments were not meant to trigger immediate consequences. They were meant to shape the conditions under which consequences would be interpreted later. That realization changed the way I viewed everything that followed, because it meant every action had been calculated with future response in mind. My phone rang again, and this time it was my attorney calling earlier than expected. His tone immediately focused. He told me he had received updated filings and additional disclosures from the opposing side, and that the financial posture being presented was consistent with a controlled separation strategy designed to establish temporary imbalance before formal negotiation. I listened carefully without interrupting, because interrupting would not change the legal framework that was already in motion. He continued by outlining immediate protective steps that could be taken, including restricting secondary account access, enforcing notification escalation for any financial activity above a certain threshold, and initiating a full audit of shared digital authorization pathways. Each recommendation was practical, procedural, and entirely detached from emotion, which made it easier to process. After the call, I remained seated for a long moment, looking at the reflection of the screens in the window glass, and I noticed something subtle but important in my own thinking. I was no longer asking why this had happened. I was only asking how it had been executed, and that shift removed a layer of noise I had not realized was still present. I opened a new secure folder and began consolidating all documentation into a single structured sequence, labeling each event not by how it felt, but by what function it served within the timeline: access change, financial withdrawal, legal initiation, notification alignment. And as I worked through it, I began to see how deliberately each step had been positioned to reduce my ability to respond in real time, not through force, but through timing. The most effective control was often invisible until it was already in place, Around 10 in the evening, Rachel sent another message, short and formal, stating that she expected compliance with temporary financial boundaries and requested confirmation of receipt. I read it twice without responding, not out of avoidance, but because responding prematurely would have introduced emotion into a process that was already operating on structure alone. Instead, I forwarded it to my attorney and asked for it to be included in the ongoing record. I then stood up and walked through the house again, noticing how unchanged everything appeared from the outside. The same furniture, the same lighting, the same quiet suburban atmosphere that suggested stability to anyone looking in. But internally, I understood that stability and structure were not the same thing. Stability was appearance, structure was control, and what I was dealing with now was entirely structural. I returned to my desk and reviewed the updated legal guidance once more, focusing on what actions preserved visibility and prevented further unilateral adjustment of shared systems. And as I implemented each step, I felt the situation shift slightly, not toward resolution, but toward balance, because balance was the only condition under which decisions could be made without distortion. And for the first time since everything began, I was no longer reacting to a sequence already in motion. I was actively maintaining my position within it, ensuring that nothing else could move without leaving a trace that could be measured, verified, and responded to with precision. By the time the next morning approached, I was no longer thinking in terms of what had happened, but in terms of what was still moving without my permission, because that was the only distinction that mattered now. What was finished and what was still active. I had slept very little, not because of emotional distress, but because my mind had settled into a continuous review state, processing every piece of information I had gathered and testing it against possible outcomes. When I entered the kitchen just after sunrise, the house felt unchanged again on the surface. The same quiet suburban light in Naperville filtering through the windows, the same stillness that would have suggested nothing was wrong to anyone outside of it. But I no longer relied on surface impressions. I checked my phone immediately, not for messages, but for activity logs that my attorney had set up overnight. And what I saw confirmed that the system we had put in place was now functioning as intended. Every attempted access to shared accounts was now generating real-time alerts. Every financial adjustment request required secondary verification, and the structure that had previously been fluid was now constrained within visible boundaries. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was uncertain, but because I was observing the difference between uncontrolled flow and contained structure, and that difference was now measurable. Around mid-morning, I received a call from my attorney again, this time more detailed. He informed me that additional disclosures had been reviewed and that the opposing filing had included assumptions about asset liquidity and access continuity that were no longer valid under the current restrictions. He explained that once those assumptions were invalidated, the leverage structure of the entire filing would shift, not immediately in emotional terms, but in procedural terms that would matter during formal review. I listened carefully and took notes even though I already understood the implication, because documentation was now part of maintaining position, not just preparation. After the call, I reviewed the updated financial map we had created together, and I noticed something important that had not been visible before. Certain withdrawal attempts had been scheduled in alignment with known account refresh cycles, meaning whoever had initiated them understood the timing of system updates well enough to anticipate short windows of reduced oversight. That level of awareness confirmed what I had begun to suspect earlier. This was not random adaptation. It was informed planning. I leaned back in my chair and let that realization settle without resistance, because resisting it would not change its accuracy. Instead, I focused on response structure. I adjusted the remaining access parameters through legal coordination, so that any future movement would require layered authorization rather than single-point approval. And in doing so, I effectively removed the ability for unilateral financial adjustment without immediate detection. Later in the afternoon, I received a brief message from Rachel again, more direct this time, asking for confirmation that restrictions were temporary and requesting clarification on when normal access would be restored. I read it once, and then set the phone down without responding, not as a gesture of defiance, but because the answer was no longer something I controlled alone. It was now governed by process, and process does not respond to urgency. It responds to compliance. I spent the rest of the day refining the documentation file with my attorney, ensuring every transaction, every access attempt, and every communication was aligned chronologically, because chronology was now the only language that could not be disputed. As evening approached, I walked through the house again and noticed how differently I perceived it compared to just a few days earlier. Nothing had physically changed, but everything had shifted in meaning. Spaces that once felt shared now felt defined by usage history, and silence that once felt neutral now felt informational. And in that quiet, I understood the final shift in my position. I was no longer trying to recover what had been lost. I was maintaining what remained within a controlled system. And that meant every future action would be measured not by emotion, but by its impact on structure, visibility, and balance within a situation that was no longer unfolding randomly, but following a sequence that I could now read clearly enough to anticipate the next move before it arrived. By the time the morning light returned to Naperville, I was already awake, sitting at my desk with a sense of stillness that no longer felt like uncertainty. Because over the past several days I had learned to distinguish between emotional noise and structural movement. And what I was seeing now was not noise. I checked the overnight reports from the financial monitoring system first, and immediately noticed multiple access attempts that had been automatically flagged and paused. Each attempt carried the same pattern, timing aligned with early morning hours, likely chosen to avoid immediate response windows. But every attempt now stopped at the same threshold, requiring verification that could not be completed unilaterally. I did not react to it emotionally. I simply recorded it as expected behavior within a constrained system. A few minutes later, my attorney called, and his tone carried a different weight than previous conversations. Not urgency, but confirmation. He informed me that the opposing side had formally acknowledged restricted access conditions and had requested expedited clarification through legal channels, which in practical terms meant that the initial financial control strategy had encountered a structural barrier it did not anticipate. I listened without interrupting, letting every detail settle into place before responding, and when I did speak, I asked only about next procedural steps. He explained that the next phase would involve formal asset disclosure validation and timeline verification, meaning every financial movement would now be examined not as isolated actions, but as part of a documented sequence. After the call ended, I remained seated for a moment longer, looking at the quiet street outside my window, and I realized something important had shifted overnight, not in terms of conflict, but in terms of visibility, because once actions become traceable in sequence, they lose their ability to remain ambiguous. Around mid-morning, Rachel called directly, and I answered immediately this time, not because I expected resolution, but because I needed to understand tone. Her voice was different from previous calls, less controlled, slightly compressed, as if she was adjusting to conditions she had not fully anticipated. She asked why certain accounts were no longer accessible and whether I had initiated full restriction protocols. I told her calmly that all financial systems were now operating under joint legal oversight. There was a pause on the line that lasted longer than any of our previous conversations, and in that silence I could hear the adjustment happening in real time. She responded by stating that she needed access restored for ongoing financial obligations. But the request was no longer framed as a demand. It carried acknowledgement of limitation. I told her that all adjustments would now proceed through legal review, and that neither side had unilateral control over shared accounts at this stage. After the call ended, I did not analyze it emotionally. I simply logged it as confirmation of system equilibrium. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the full financial map again with my attorney, and we identified the final remaining exposure points, mostly linked to delayed transactions that had been scheduled before restrictions were applied. Those were now being processed under monitoring conditions, meaning any deviation would immediately trigger documentation and review. By early afternoon, another notification arrived. This time not a call or message, but a formal legal acknowledgement indicating that Rachel's legal representation had requested structured mediation scheduling. And for the first time since everything began, the process was no longer unilateral in perception. It had become procedural on both sides. I stepped away from my desk and walked through the house slowly, noticing how the environment no longer carried the same emotional weight it had in the first days. It had become neutral space again, defined not by what had happened in it, but by what could still be documented from it. When I returned to my office, I opened a new file and began preparing for what the attorney called forward stabilization, which meant ensuring that all remaining shared structures were locked into verifiable sequence before any negotiation phase began. Later that evening, Rachel sent a final message, shorter than all previous ones, stating that she would proceed through legal mediation and requesting confirmation that all financial restrictions would remain temporary pending resolution. I read it once, then closed the message without responding, not out of avoidance, but because the answer no longer required personal delivery. It existed within the system we had both entered, and as I sat back in my chair, I understood clearly that the situation had reached its next phase, not escalation, not resolution, but formal structure, where every action, every request, and every adjustment would now be recorded, reviewed, and measured against the same framework. And in that framework, emotion no longer determined direction, only sequence did. And for the first time since the morning everything began, I was no longer reacting to events as they unfolded. I was operating entirely within the system that had been built around them. The morning of the mediation confirmation, I woke up before sunrise and stayed still for a long moment, not because I was uncertain about what would happen next, but because I was aware that the situation had now entered its final structural phase, where interpretation mattered less than documentation. I sat at my desk and reviewed the latest updates from the legal system, and everything was now aligned into a formal timeline. Financial restrictions were active, access permissions were standardized under dual oversight, and all shared accounts were now under monitored conditions pending mediation. There was no longer any ambiguity in the system, only sequence and record. When my attorney called, his tone was steady and deliberate. He confirmed that both parties had agreed to structured mediation scheduling within the next week, and that preliminary disclosures from both sides had been submitted for review. He explained that at this stage the process was no longer about escalation or resistance, but about validation of claims and reconciliation of financial records. I listened carefully, not because I needed reassurance, but because every detail added to the completeness of the timeline I had been building. After the call, I stood and walked through the house slowly, noticing how the environment had stabilized into something almost neutral. The emotional weight that had once filled every space was no longer present, replaced instead by a quiet absence of unresolved movement. My phone buzzed around mid-morning, and Rachel's name appeared on the screen again. I answered immediately. Her voice was different now, less certain, more measured. She asked about the mediation process and whether I intended to challenge financial disclosures directly. I told her that everything would proceed through formal legal channels and that all information would be evaluated based on documented sequence rather than assumption. There was another long pause, and I could sense the shift in how she was processing the system she had initiated. She then said that she expected the process to remain fair and structured, and I responded that fairness in this context was defined by documentation, not perception. After the call ended, I did not dwell on it emotionally. I simply logged it as confirmation that both sides were now operating under the same procedural framework. By afternoon, I met briefly with my attorney through a secure call, and we reviewed the final structure of the mediation preparation. He explained that the key focus would be reconciliation of financial movement timelines, verification of authorization changes, and validation of asset status prior to separation execution. Every point he mentioned matched exactly what I had already documented, which reinforced the understanding that nothing in this situation was random. It was all sequential. I spent the remainder of the day organizing every remaining record into a unified file, ensuring that each financial action, each access change, and each communication was aligned in chronological order, because chronology had become the only stable reference point in the entire process. As evening approached, I received one final message from Rachel, shorter than all the previous ones, stating only that she would see me at mediation and that she hoped the process would remain respectful. I read it once and closed the message, without responding, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to interpret outside the system. We were now both fully inside. I sat back in my chair and looked at the completed timeline on my screen, and for the first time since everything began, I understood the full shape of what had happened, not as emotional collapse, not as sudden betrayal, but as a structured transition that had moved through clearly defined stages until it reached formal resolution. And in that understanding there was no shock remaining, only clarity, because every action that had once felt chaotic now fit into a single continuous sequence. And as I saved the final version of the file and powered down the screen, I realized that the situation had already moved beyond reaction, beyond anticipation, and beyond conflict. It had reached its endpoint in structure, where everything was documented, everything was accounted for, and nothing further could happen without being recorded in the same system that now defined both of our positions.